Good morning to all of you and to those of us, to those who are watching online. We appreciate your being here. I want to mention a couple of things that are coming up this week and some folks we need to remember to pray for. But this coming Saturday at 8 o'clock in the morning, we're having a men's prayer breakfast here in the Wiles Fellowship Hall. All of our men are invited, and I understand biscuits and gravy are on the menu. You can't miss that with that, so please plan on coming. I plan to be there Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Remember also to pray for some folks who have been very, very sick. Bob Johnson is presently at Washington Regional Medical Center. Bob has had a brain bleed, and Monday they're going to do a procedure to relieve the pressure on his brain by draining some of that blood. So remember Bob and Anita in your prayers. Also remember Hazel Stewart. She's staying with her grandson in Bentonville and his family. Hazel has had a spell the other day, and she's not been doing all that well. She's been dehydrated, and there might be some other issues too, so further testing will be there. And remember Mason Smith, who continues on hospice and declines quite slowly. If we are a congregation of friends and family, and if you don't know any of these folks that I just mentioned because you're new or you haven't been here that long, that's fine. But please ask me, and I'll introduce you sometime. In fact, Tom Williams will introduce you to folks. We want to know one another. We're friends and family here, so please feel free to ask for our help and ask our elders as well. Of course, if you say, I don't know any of your elders, well then I'll introduce you to some of our elders. So please feel free to do that very thing. Thank you. To get where we are in Acts 25, in our text today, let me summarize the whole story. Paul went to Jerusalem, the town where he was reared in his physical and his spiritual upbringing was in Jerusalem. Interestingly, he had some time in Rome, apparently, and may very well, and was from the town of Tarsus, which was in southern Turkey. He narrowly escaped an assassination plot in Jerusalem, was taken to Caesarea under, well, to say guard is understating it. He had 470 soldiers guarding him on his way to Caesarea. 470 soldiers. He appeared before Governor Felix for a trial in Caesarea, and, well, the Jews had lots of charges but no evidence, nothing but hearsay and confusion. And Paul said, well, I haven't done anything that they've accused me of except I am a follower of the way. And then Paul was kept in prison for a couple of years until a new governor came in, a governor named Festus, who replaced Felix. Nero replaced Felix with Festus. He wanted to dispense with the case. Festus did. He came in, a new guy, he's cleaning up old business. And so he orders a hearing in Caesarea for Paul, Festus does. And here is what happened. We're in Acts 25, verse 9. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? What would have been a favor to the Jews was definitely no favor to Paul. Take him back to Jerusalem for trial. Then he's off our hands. But then Paul had already appealed to Caesar. Well, anyway, he says, are you willing to go up there? Paul answered, I'm now standing in Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done any wrong to the Jews, as you yourselves know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. So he knew if he went back to Jerusalem, he was a dead man. He said, I appeal to Caesar. And after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Just remember, it's not a good thing to go back to Jerusalem. Not a good thing. Earlier in the chapter, we learned that the Jews were planning an ambush should they go back to Jerusalem with Paul. It's amazing how unholy, bloodthirsty people lived in the holy city of Jerusalem. I hope we never get past the shock of that. You say, well, I wonder, are there bad people in the church? You bet there are bad people in the church. You bet they are. There were bad people in Jerusalem. There were bad people in the temple. How can you tell? By the way they act. By the way they act. See, that's convicting. That's a pretty thoroughgoing challenge to our own self-righteousness, isn't it? So we say, here is a town full of people who are not worthy of the name Jew. And yet here they are in positions of leadership. But God had made a promise to Paul, and Paul would cooperate with that promise. And the promise was, God's going to get you, I'm going to get you to Rome. Now, he had the right to do that because he was a Roman citizen. Every Roman citizen was special and was favored. Formal citizenship in the Roman Empire was not a given, was not an automatic. Citizenship meant that you were in the ruling class of people, you were probably quite wealthy, and for sure connected by family to somebody important. You couldn't be tortured or beaten without a trial. A Roman citizen could never be crucified as the method of capital punishment. Roman citizens couldn't be crucified. You could not be examined without charges. Back in the day, people were tortured for information. It was illegal to torture a Roman citizen for information of any kind. Nor were they to be executed, a Roman citizen, hurriedly, because Romans were given special treatment. They had to be given due process. A Roman citizen then could also appeal to the highest court in the land, to Nero himself, the Caesar. But Paul would have a long and winding road to Rome, as we learn, as we'll continue on this study next week when Jared talks about Acts 26 with you. Festus doesn't know exactly how to write up the charges against Paul. He doesn't really have any charges against Paul. If he's going to send him to Rome to be tried by the emperor, they got to have some charges. So a surprise visit from Agrippa and his consort, Bernice, and, well, I'll hear him. Festus says, hey, I'll tell you what. Festus says, I'll tell you what, I've got a guy here that I don't have any charges written up against him, and before I get him to Rome, I need to really write up some charges. Is that crazy or what? And so it says, I need some charges, and Agrippa says, well, I'll listen to the guy. So Festus was a friend of Nero's. Nero appointed him to be proconsul in Caesarea. Nero was bloodthirsty and crazy, and he hired Festus. So you can kind of figure that Festus is not the nicest guy. Doesn't bother Paul at all. He speaks of Jesus forthrightly and openly and unashamedly and matter-of-factly. And then we have Agrippa, who is one of the Herods, a family dynasty. He will hear Paul in Acts 26, but let me tell you about the Herods, because Paul would talk to anybody about Jesus. He'd talk to anybody, even Festus. Even Festus. Got a slide of the Herod family tree. I know you guys in adult Bible class this morning, you got a little warm-up on this. In fact, it's identical. It's a good one. It's a good one. I will tell you where this came from. It was compiled from Bible history and from also ancient historical sources, like the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived at the time of Jesus. Also Tacitus, a Roman historian. So we have a pretty good sense of a chronology that has been put together with biblical and extra-biblical sources. So we can kind of know how these guys came to be and who the Herods are. Herod the Great, just for your information, who's at the top of the tree, Herod the Great is one that ordered the babies in Bethlehem to be murdered when he was told that the King of the Jews was going to be born there. That's Herod the Great. Not a nice guy. Interestingly, though, Herod the Great finished a temple in Jerusalem for the Jews. He ingratiated himself to the Jews. He was a political genius. He was bloodthirsty, hateful, and terrible, but he was a political genius. And so he had the Jews pretty much on his side, and even had the idea of him being a Jew confused. It was always a hazy area. He had 4 boys. He had Aristobulus, who you never hear about in the Bible. You hear about Archelaus, who's only mentioned once in the Bible, in Matthew 2:22. And then you have Herod Antipas and Philip. Most of the references in the Gospels of a Herod are Herod Antipas. Herod had a part in the trial of Jesus in Jerusalem before he was crucified. Herod Antipas was the one that called for Jesus to come and do some miracles. That's Herod Antipas. Philip, we know because he had an interaction with John the Baptizer. Well, actually, Philip ruled part of Palestine. It was Philip's wife, Herodias. Notice Herodias would be Philip's niece. Herodias, Philip was her uncle. Like say it's their family tree was kind of like one branch, okay? Just one arm, okay. Started with a stump and went straight up. I'm trying to get all the pronouns correct here. Philip was married to Herodias, his niece, okay? But Herod Antipas, Philip's brother, wooed her and stole her away from Philip. So Herodias went from marrying one uncle and then married another uncle. All right? Now, before you get too completely discombobulated by this, I will say that amongst ruling families, marrying an uncle or a niece, as obnoxious as that sounds to us, was not that uncommon in ancient times. However, taking your brother's wife, that's obnoxious, even if it is your niece, okay? John the Baptizer had something to say about that, if you'll remember. He went to Herod and told him, he said, you should not have Philip, your brother's wife. And guess who it was that ordered John the Baptizer to lose his head? Herodias. You remember her, okay? That's Herodias. That's Herod Antipas's wife. Who also, and then you have Herod Agrippa the first, who we don't hear much about. He was the king that was eaten by worms. Remember? He was in Tyre, and he had a great big speech, and everybody said, the voice of a God and not of a man. And Agrippa said, bring it, bring it, bring it. It wasn't long, and he was eaten by worms. That's Herod Agrippa the first. Herod Agrippa the second is the one we're talking about today. Herod Agrippa the second was, well, I should say Bernice was his sister. Bernice was a consort of Herod Agrippa II, and as was mentioned in our class, and for the rest of us, he was thought to have engaged in incest with her. There was quite a scandal. That's a little too close relation. Marrying your cousin or marrying your uncle wasn't that bad, but marrying your sister definitely was. And there was quite a deal about that. Drusilla was married to Felix, and you find out how Felix got his job as the governor before Festus, because he was well connected politically by Drusilla, who was the sister of Bernice and Agrippa. All right. Having said all of that, I just say this. This family was messed up. Majorly messed up. And Paul didn't care who he was talking to. When you're going to share the gospel, you're going to people who need the Lord. And it doesn't matter what they've done or where they've been, who they've married, they need to hear the gospel. And so, Paul talked to Felix, Drusilla's husband. He talked to Agrippa II and to Bernice, his sister, who he may have been sleeping with. Crazy, huh? One of the great privileges of my life was to work with a woman who had a few months, at least I thought she had a few months to live before I met her. She was one of our hospice patients, and she nearly killed herself ODing on heroin. She said that she woke in a bathtub naked with a needle sticking out of her arm. She had survived that. She was shortly thereafter diagnosed with cancer. She was one of the Hell's Angels. She was a card-carrying member of the Hells Angels. She wore the leather jacket and she ran with that crowd. Drug use, crime sprees, indiscriminate sexual activity. Now she was dying, and when I took a job as a hospice chaplain, she became one of my patients. And she was tough, and she was profane and vindictive, and she wanted to see me. And I couldn't imagine why. So I went over there with a great deal of unease in visiting Joanne. Joanne and I established an acquaintance at first. I got to know her, but her situation grew desperate. She was in danger of becoming homeless. She had no resources, and she was so ill she couldn't work. She was eventually kicked out of her residence, no place to go. Without going into all the details, I will tell you that by the grace of God, she found a low-income apartment in extraordinary time, miraculous time, where she could find a place to live for practically nothing because she had no income. Her sister was dealing drugs, as was her niece, and they lived on and off with her. And so I just kept going to the apartment and visiting with her, and what a situation. I would talk about the God who had rescued her from her homelessness, from her drug overdose, from the biker gang. I took her a Bible. The next time I saw her, she was using the Bible I had given her for a coaster. She told me that. It had rings all over the top of the Bible. And she said, I hope you don't mind. I said, I gave you the Bible to do with what you want to. I said, I just believe that it's got the answers if you want them. And so she began to read her Bible. And over months of time, Joanne was softened by the power of the Spirit. I began to tell her of a God who loved her and his Son who died for her and was raised from the dead for her. And that it was that power that had sustained her as long as he had. I couldn't believe it at first, but she asked one day in the week that I baptized her. I called Deb and we baptized her in her bathtub. Frankly, I had never talked with anybody with as checkered a past as Joanne. She eventually began to work with a house church that I was associated with and teaching. And she found herself loved and loving in ways that she never thought was possible by good people. And they loved her. Joanne came to our daughter's wedding in white. I loved it. Our daughter Jill loved it. Women don't wear white at a wedding. The bride is the only one who's supposed to wear white, okay? I just brought you up to speed, okay? Joanne had bought the white dress for the occasion, and I thought it was a beautiful picture of exactly where she stood with God. She was white and pure. The Apostle Paul did not care to whom he spoke about Jesus. This family was messed up. He went and talked to them about Jesus. Talked to almost half of them. Paul didn't win Festus, and he didn't win Agrippa, as we'll find out next week. But he did find his way to Rome. And he didn't care who he testified about Jesus to. That was just Paul. One last thing. The message that Festus heard was simple. He explained to King Agrippa the nub of Paul's message, which should be the core of our message to those who are here. Here's Festus's explanation to Agrippa about what Paul had been teaching and the situation that Paul was in, okay? And I find this interesting because this is an unbeliever writing, an unbeliever talking, okay? Verse 18. When his accusers got up to speak, they didn't charge him. This is Festus talking about how the trial had gone in Jerusalem. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. I want to stop there and say, you think? If you don't believe in the resurrection, this is a big thing to swallow. I don't know what I'm going to do with this guy. He says he knows a guy who was dead and is now alive. I don't know what to do with this. So I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear this man myself. And he replied, tomorrow you will hear him. There is this dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. This gives rise to the most important question that we Christ followers must answer correctly, or we will never get the world to know about Jesus. And that question is, what is the good news about Jesus? If I don't give you the answer right now, would you be able to tell me what that is? Would you know the answer? It's amazing. We talk about being good and growing up in Christ and all of that, but do you know what the good news of Jesus is? It's really important. It's the most important thing we do around here. We tell each other the gospel, and when we go outside and we tell others the gospel too. If we don't answer this question correctly, then we have nothing to offer anybody that is worth anything. We got to know this question, the answer to this question. If the church is the gospel, we're in trouble. When people observe the waywardness of churches, and believe me, there's waywardness in all churches, they will abandon them. Because if the gospel is the church are a bunch of people who are sometimes unreliable, and they are not perfect. And if correct worship is the gospel, that's shooting way too low. When worship doesn't satisfy our desires or our customs, then people will look for the gospel elsewhere. Well, you just don't have a good enough worship service, or your worship service is a little too progressive for me. You're shooting too low if you think that's the good news of Jesus. But then a correct understanding of the Bible. How about that? Is that the good news of Jesus? Well, if our traditions and our interpretations are the gospel, that means if people don't follow us there, if they don't understand our reasoning, good thinking, sincere people don't understand our reasoning, that means they cannot partake of the gospel. They cannot know Jesus. Wow. That's close to blasphemy, folks. You know, a correct understanding of the Bible is not a prerequisite for salvation. After all, Christ saved his apostles before they understood the Scriptures, didn't he? Think about that. These guys didn't really know what was going on. But they were in a right relationship with him. Why? Because they trusted him, well, at least most of the time. They left everything to follow him. They loved him. And when they placed their complete trust in him, they were secured by his grace, not by an extensive, exhaustive education in the Bible, but by simple faith and obedience to what they knew about Jesus Christ. You see, the good news, what is the gospel? It's all about Jesus. It's about a dead man named Jesus who's alive. Period. Everything that is good news in the world is connected to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Paul knew that. He told his Corinthian brothers and sisters this. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, he said, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand." I want to remind you, Paul said. Now, why do I want to remind you? Because Paul had just trudged through a bunch of really sticky, muddy, messy issues with this church. They had incest in this church. They had rifts in this church. They had people who thought the Lord's Supper was a chance to get together and have a little wine party. They had people who were confused about marriage and divorce and whether they should get married or not. They had problems all over the place. he went through each one of these issues one after another. Boom, boom, boom. Then he circles back, as we talk about now. He circles back and he says, but I want to remind you of something. I want to remind you of the gospel that I first delivered to you and on which we take our stand. He could not stop talking about the resurrection and about Christ. He goes to verse 2. He says, by this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you, otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it is I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed. Nothing like going back to the foundation, which is the death, burial, and rising of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. It is the job of every preacher and teacher in the Lord's church, in every fellowship, to make sure that the main thing remains the main thing. The main thing is this, the death, burial, and rising of Jesus Christ. That it was witnessed by hundreds of believers, real people in real time, including Paul himself. We have been stuck far too long talking about things that are not the main thing. For so long we have feared speaking with the lost and wandering folks in our lives because we don't think we can change them. Their lives are too much of a mess. But if we will share the main thing, let the Holy Spirit change them. Do not be afraid. Flex those faith muscles and tell the story of this dead man Jesus who was alive to someone you can't imagine accepting it, and watch yourself be surprised. Then love and care for those with whom you share that. Every week I read an article about someone who's got the answer for falling church attendance in the United States. And I know we've kicked that around here a lot. What's happened? What's happened? We throw our hands up. The experts tell us, well, it's outreach. It's outreach. We don't emphasize outreach. These same experts are busy debating difficult theologies, though, with followers of Jesus Christ. These same people who are saying that it's outreach have plenty of time to write books in opposition to other books that have been written by other folks who disagree with them on some theological issue. It seems to me that we spend too much time trying to perfect one another and not enough time telling people who have never heard, who have never seen a real Christian. Because so few have seen real Christ followers. And we can do this. We need not be angry with anyone but Satan. Our conflict is not with him. It is not with the lost who are confused and needing a path to walk that leads to life. Don't be mad at them. They've been misled. The resurrection of the dead man, Jesus, is that path and is that story. Tell that story. You can do this by the power who lives in you. Will you do that? People will come. But we need to be sure that we're not providing only corrective teaching, but consecrating teaching. And that is about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That needs to be the thing people hear from us all the time. No matter what the rest of Christendom is out there doing, we need to be doing that. Christ's resurrection is the gospel. He lives. He empowers. He forgives by His blood. He intercedes in our prayers. He gives life to all who receive Him. If He can forgive a blaspheming son of Satan like Saul of Tarsus or like my friend Joanne, He can turn you into a child of God. If you've wandered off the true path to life, there is some sin in your life that trips you up and causes you grief and discouragement, we will pray for you and with you this morning if you need to. All you need to do during the singing of this song is to come to the front. If you want to give your life in trusting faith to Jesus in baptism, we urge you to do that. We want everyone here to leave saved. And the story is Jesus is waiting. This risen Jesus is waiting. He's urging you to come. And He's doing that, giving us that opportunity right now as we stand and as we sing.